Thank you all for coming today. My name is Jill Baker-Gower, and I'm a faculty member in the art program, and I teach jewelry and metalsmithing. I'm also the chair of the Visiting Artists Series Committee. The Visiting Artists Series is a collaboration between the Cleve Clarney Museum of Art, the programs of art, architecture, photography, and interior design. This is our last lecture of the school year, so be on the lookout for next year's schedule in the fall. As a reminder, we encourage the audience to silence phones and stay for the entire lecture. At the end of the talk, we should have time to take a few questions. I'm particularly excited to announce today's visiting artist, Jessica Calderwood. Jessica introduced me to enameling over 20 years ago. Trained as a metalsmith and enamelist, Jessica Calderwood's art objects make statements about contemporary life using craft-based media. Since receiving her BFA from the Cleveland Institute of Art and her MFA from Arizona State University, her work has been exhibited extensively throughout the US and internationally. She has participated in artist residencies with the John Michael Kohler Arts Industry Program, the Faro Corporation, Mesa Art Center, and the Pittsburgh Glass Center. Her work has been published in Metalsmith Magazine, American Craft, and The Art of Enameling. Work from her various series can be found in numerous collections, including the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Racine Art Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Yale University of Art, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. She is currently a professor of art at Ball State University in Indiana. Welcome, Jessica.
All right, thank you so much, College of DuPage, for having me, and especially Professor Jill Baker-Gower for the invitation. And thanks for coming, all of you. So I realized that this is not the right slide, so this is my starting image. And so I just wanted to talk to you about my roots a little bit. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and I wanted to show a presentation that's not necessarily completely chronological, but really kind of talking about how my studio practice has been really influenced by where I come from, the places that I've moved to, and the spaces that I've worked in that are very much about a sense of place and identity. So it will be loosely chronological. But anyways, I really wanted to go to school as an artist from the time that I have memory. And so I wanted to go to school to become a painter. I was really interested in image making and thought that that was my future. And, but I ended up going to the Cleveland Institute of Art, which has its roots in a lot of industrialism, you know? And so I took a class in metalworking and specifically in enameling with this artist, Gretchen Goss. And enameling is the process of fusing glass to metal. So it's very similar to glazing a pot, but you're just using a different substrate. And this particular artist was so influential because she really was approaching metalworking and enameling as another surface for images. And I found that to be really exciting. And so once I discovered torches, right, and fire and this conversation of a material being transformed through the process of heat, I was just completely captivated. And so being from Cleveland, which has all this like amazing industrialism, from my time as an undergraduate student, I really became interested in working in industrial spaces to make my work. So I started kind of finding companies and different corporations that were small enough for me to access them and basically creating my own residencies. And so I was really interested in the beginning of having this dialogue with another industry and learning from their process and also expanding my scale. So I was really energized by that kind of conversation, and that's really kind of set a practice for me throughout my entire time as an artist. As a young 20-something, starting to make work and thinking about how I can use this material in an interesting way, I was really interested in talking about gender and talking about my experiences as moving through the world as a young woman and how that has not always been like the most pleasant experience at times. And so I wasn't making jewelry, which is oftentimes the format that was, people were known for this enameling process. I started making these big sculptural reliefs. So these are just a couple of pieces from that very early series. And I would take images that I was finding from pop culture. I remember I got this image. It was a photograph from a New York Times magazine about a doctor, and he specialized in weird smells. So it had this very enticing image, but kind of grabbed that, and then I did a lot of hand drawing into this powdered glass, and so kind of trying to find ways to combine form, which metal can do so easily, and combining that with some of these really interesting images to create a narrative that was talking about some of my life experiences. So kind of thinking about a form that could reference part of the body in a way, thinking about hips perhaps, and the way that our bodies kind of bulge and flex. So that was like in the early 2000s that I was making some of that work. And for the students that are in the audience, like as you complete, a degree or a program and you're kind of thrown out into the world as an artist, it's really challenging. And oftentimes, there aren't as many opportunities that I was seeing as maybe some of my other peers that went into accounting, for example. So anyways, I was really starting to think about places where I could continue to make work and feel supported. And I started looking at residencies. And again, thinking about trying to find residencies that intersected with industrial process. I discovered the Kohler foundry. And is anyone familiar with Kohler products? You've probably washed your hands, in a sink that was made by the Kohler company, right? Or used one of their toilets. So they make a lot of fixtures for things, and they're up in northern Wisconsin. And they have an amazing residency where you can either go apply to work in their iron foundry and very large-scale enamel shop, because that's where they make bathtubs. Or you could go into pottery and learn about slip casting and make some work that would really challenge you. So right after undergrad, I applied for this residency, and I got it for the iron foundry and enamel shop. And it really changed the way I thought about my practice and the scale that I was working in. And before that, I was still working in something that would probably be something that was handheld, but I was able to make work that was potentially as big as a bathtub. So some tech information, because I know there aren't a ton of enamelists in the room. I know there's a class. But enamel is a powdered frit, it's glass, and it fuses to a metal base. And so in this case, it's cast iron, and it fuses anywhere from about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit to about 2,000 degrees. So what you see here is one of these gigantic kilns that is used to melt enamel onto cast iron forms as big as a bathtub. And so in order to do that, there's this gigantic seesaw fork that allows you to load. And so you load in hot, and then you take it out hot. And so there's a lot of serendipity as an artist that you can respond to in terms of what happens with that heat. Kohler has engineered this to perfection, so that way there isn't serendipity. But it was really fun and interesting to work with the workers at the factory to see how you can push this material that they've been trained to make, to a certain standard and repeat that every time, and saying well, what happens if you don't do this or that? And so I'm really interested in that sort of community collaboration that you get from those types of experiences. So there's just a couple of pictures from this process. So if anyone's interested in iron casting, or just this residency, they do tours every Friday that's free and open to the community, and not too far from here, right? Here's some of the workers that I hung out with during that residency. So in order to prep cast iron, it's cast in a sand mold, and then it's covered in soot and funk. And so he basically sandblasts or bead blasts off the castings before you prepare them to fuse glass to them. So it's basically like being inside a giant sandblaster, and he's covered in rubber and chainmail, and it's very medieval. Sweetest guy. And then here's just some of these large-scale works that I made. And it was really just a crash course in a lot of things for me. I was so young. I was learning how to collaborate with others. I was learning how to navigate being in a factory with literally 2,000 men. I was learning about mold making, and so these are all forms. I was really interested through this residency of making work that really looked soft and had the appearance of being like light, but really was, literally these were 50 pounds. So those were just some of the examples that I made. And then really, after that experience, I realized that I wanted to learn more. I wanted to experience metalworking through a more sculptural lens. I had learned casting, and I had heard that this artist named David Pimentel was a master of hand-forming metal. And so these are some examples of his work. He was the professor at Arizona that headed the metalsmithing program at the time. And so I went to Arizona State for grad school. And this was really like an amazing time as someone growing up in the Midwest. And, there's snow, and it's dark, and the lake effect. And then to get to Arizona, where you're literally riding your bike to school and passing, these beautiful banana trees. And, I think we arrived when it was 115 degrees. And it was like being on another planet, and it was amazing. And so a lot of my time there was really about exploring on a formal level, like how can I combine image with form in ways that are really pushing it. I was really exploring like abstraction on a sculptural format, and continuing with the similar themes in terms of thinking about narrative, thinking about gender and dynamics, and really, we were like feral kittens, and we were talking about it last night when I was talking to Jill about our experience there. There was very much like a sense of community amongst the students. We're all learning from each other in a way that was really supportive. So in the end, I made this thesis exhibition that didn't really have that much to do with metal at all, but isn't that what grad school does to you? So I made a lot of installations that were very much about abstractions of the body, were very much about multiples and repetition, and really was like playing more broadly with this idea of forms that were trying to walk a line between the beautiful and the grotesque. And during that time, I was also really interested in repetition as a way of like asserting a studio practice. So every day I did a drawing in enamel, and I was really trying to like figure out what my visual language was, thinking about my iconography, what am I interested in terms of content. And so that daily practice of making something and making like something in the same scale or format was really instructive for me. And so in the end, I had a record of my time as a student there, which was over 3 years. Of this kind of practice that then became this large-scale installation. So after that time, again, I think I was confronted with the reality of living, of trying to find a life as an artist, and trying to stay true to that, but also trying to pay the rent. And so at that time, I was able to find a position as an artist in residence, like long-term, at this Mesa Art Center, which had just opened. And Mesa is a suburb of Phoenix and really close to where I had gone to graduate school. And so I started this urban residency, and again, I kind of they didn't have an official program, so I just kind of went there as they were building out the architecture of it and asked, can I do this? I'll help you set up your metal studio if I can have a studio space. And it kind of blossomed into a position where I could keep teaching classes. And so for those of you who are going to be, leaving and looking for opportunities yourself, just for the students, finding opportunities that might not already exist just through building relationships and building a sense of community can pay back in some really interesting ways. So I was there for 3 years, and it was amazing because I had a place to work and then I could teach classes. But one of the rubs was that with these community classes, jewelry was the focus. And I had received a degree in this area and 2 degrees, and I was not a jeweler at all. I knew a little bit about making jewelry. But I kind of had to teach myself on the job too. So there was a lot of learning how to, make a particular type of jewelry process like the night before and then kind of rolling that out. But a lot of times then I was using those little iconography series, those daily practices, as objects that I could learn from through setting and kind of turning things into jewelry. And it actually sparked this kind of amazing side series for me that I continue to make small-scale wearables in addition to my larger-scale sculptural work. And so it fed me financially. It also like fed this idea of making a little study of something before potentially blowing it up into a larger form. And I started doing this series about hair. And I was just talking to a friend about that a second ago, that it really intersected with some of the subject matters I was thinking about with gender, and how hair is very much a signifier, of many things that you like reveal. Without saying anything, we're always saying so much about how we present ourselves. And I was really interested in using hair in that way. So I started these little pins that were all kind of, responding to this idea of how to use hair as like social or visual cues. So this is a front and back image of this piece. And I got really interested in mechanisms and sort of segued from hair to like fragments of the body, and was really interested in like learning how parts are put together. And I had never really unpacked that much before that. So this was a double-sided pin that rotates. So it's called blink. So, the eyes open, the eyes shut. And I just got really fascinated with that idea of jewelry being a really powerful way to have your work engage in public spaces in a way that a sculpture or a wall work can't, because it's static and it sits in a particular context always. I was really interested in the idea that something that we engage with and it's on the body can have a lot more exposure and allow for a lot of conversations that other work wasn't able to have. And I was also interested in the fact that I was making jewelry that was very much about the body, using that, yourself as a context. Oh, sorry, Mike. So anyways, I then moved on, and I realized when I was at the Art Center that it wasn't a sustainable way for me to make a living long term. My husband was joking with me that at the time, I had 15 different sources of income on my tax return, or I was hustling. Like, I was teaching in this town and that town and working at this gallery and trying to sell, and I was making a living, but burnout was going to be inevitable, and there was no retirement plan, or I had no benefits. So I started really looking at academia. This was in about 2007, 2008, and I got hired at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, which is a small, medium-sized state school, really not far from the Kohler residency where I did. So I kind of felt like I knew a little bit about the place from that experience. So I was hired as a tenure-line faculty member there. And one of the first orders of business was like thinking about, well, what industry can I pair with there? And so it was very much like how I was thinking about working. I had my studio work, I had my place of making, but who can I partner with to push my work forward in some ways? And so this was around the time where I really started thinking about rapid prototyping methods, thinking about how can I use like some, like software prep to do some of the work that I wanted in my practice to work larger, faster, smarter. So anyways, I found this amazing laser cutting facility that wasn't too far from there called Nemesis Metals, which was like a really cool name. And he was really generous. Again, I kind of just reached out. I didn't send an email. I went in and introduced myself, and I could just place an order, but I asked for a tour, and we started a professional friendship. And in the beginning, because he was really interested in arts, and he didn't know that many artists, he kind of thought we were all unicorns, and he wasn't sure if we really existed in space. And he started cutting work for free for me, and it was like first one's for free. It was like drugs, and then I had to start paying. But anyways, I started making these larger forms, and he started cutting these like elaborate edges for some of these like larger sculptural objects that I was really interested in making. And we started a really it was sort of a dialogue back and forth. And so I started thinking about making these pieces that were very much about consumption. So I started making these are big platters that could sit on a tabletop or on a wall. But very much also a canvas for some of this illustrative work. And so for the students that are in the enameling class, just to tech out for a second, so I'll be showing you some of these techniques, so how to use underglazes and using china paints and a lot of the sort of layered hand drawing, but then using some rapid prototyping for certain aspects. So like this really elaborate pierced form out of really thick steel. So all of that was built on Illustrator, cut, and then incorporated with the enamel. I was using a lot of like friends as models, so I was like, you know, drawing from life, drawing a little bit from pop culture, kind of collaging references, but all of that work was done by hand for the images. And I also am really interested in historical objects. I don't know if anybody else has a similar affinity, but I'm really interested in looking at what's been made in my field and thinking about those kinds of conversations of the past and the present. So I gave myself some assignments for some of my jewelry work where I was looking at some like older references. And so here you can see on this left, this is not mine. So this is from the 1700s and portraits of aristocracy. They seem kind of stuffy, you know, like of another time. Maybe not super relatable, but I was really interested in the technical aspects of it. And so I started really like honing in and learning more about how that enamel process was getting these beautiful, luscious, layered surfaces. It's all pointillism. So thinking about this piece is about 4 inches tall. And so if anyone's ever tried pointillism on a larger scale, like it's kind of humbling. So anyways, and then I tried to do a more contemporary example of that. So I made the piece on the right called Mother's Little Helper. Is anyone a Rolling Stone fan? No? Yeah, okay, right on. So I like titles that kind of reference, lots of pop culture stuff. And so anyways, I wanted to learn stone setting and capturing as my other technical challenge. So I was learning about pearls and kind of thinking about ways that I can incorporate this idea of consumption and that the stone is adding like some sort of like cue back into some of the drawing and painting elements. Why am I interested in consumption? I was thinking about that as it intersects with gender, you know, like how the pressure to be a certain way, and thinking about that as sort of like a cue to talk about larger issues that many people might have some, you know, be able to relate to. So I kind of continue this idea of these references to historical process and thinking about like, you know, using also devices in my work to think about like blocking out or censoring certain portrait elements as a way to like talk about the idea of like denying access and really talking about the gaze a bit. For those of you who are in the class later, so the portrait was all hand-drawn, which we'll go over, and then the floral element that's in the center, which is very much referencing Rene Magritte, that work, it's all made with a decal. So it was a pre-printed image that was then sort of transferred and fused on. So dealing with like hand-drawn and then appropriated images. So around this time, after I had started my full-time position, which occupied a huge amount of my, you know, time and mental space and energy, I also started a family. So I gave birth to my first child in 2010. And so as a person moving through the world, you know, working full time, having a thriving practice in my studio work, and then a mother, it was pretty intense. And so I stopped making for, a year or so, and really found that having that experience of having a baby, starting a family, really shifts your whole sense of self. It shifts your priorities, it shifts your focus, and it definitely shifts the way that people see you. And so it was very difficult as a person who felt like I was a very independent and very strong-willed woman. I felt like I became this invisible milk maker, diaper changer, and it was a very difficult time. And I won't go into too many gross details, but once I did get back into making, I very much took like this shift in how I was thinking about a lot of the work I was making. So anyways, I kind of felt like it was a time where I didn't have any sort of sense of self. I was just kind of this invisible mother, And I wanted to then make work that was responding to that. And I remember there were so many instances where people would say to you as a young mom, like, oh, this must be such a beautiful time. So beautiful, so you must be so happy. And I remember there were beautiful times, but there were also a lot of times where there was a reality that wasn't acknowledged, where it was like, this is not beautiful. It's actually quite traumatizing and frustrating at times, but it was all kind of, glossed over. And I didn't feel like I had much sense of like my agency once that happened. So anyways, I'm trying to explain the imagery, but I took that idea of like this beautiful time, that phrase just kept really repeating in my head. And so I was like, I'm gonna make this like big stupid flower, this like beautiful flower girl, all right? And just take out my head, take out my brain, take out my arms as my agency and just cover it all up, but still have those sexy legs because you still have to look cute. So that's kind of where I took this shift in my work. And so I also shifted the format. Like I was in this like circular pattern form, and I started making these large canvases, but they're made out of metal. So I made these large paintings, and I made a lot of them. I'm only gonna show one, but I really made a large quantity of these different variations. And once I started doing that, I was really interested in seeing these as in the round and sculpturally. So I started working in a totally different medium, and I started learning about ceramics a bit, and I started hand building, and I wanted to make these like almost human scale. So they're a little bit smaller than that because I learned about shrinkage. But I started off with these very mixed media pieces, and I was sort of making in my studio, which was my basement at the time. So that was built over an exercise ball, just for reference. So a big exercise ball. And hand built these earthenware legs and some mix of, I made these flowers out of enamel. I took some like found plastic flowers and was just really kind of exploring materiality, sort of hard and soft. And there was something there that resonated for me. However, I was learning about materials and strength, and for any of the ceramicists in the room, the earthenware was a poor choice for weight. So the legs shattered. They didn't make like the first transport to the first show. And so I was like, shoot, I gotta build some better legs. So I decided to go back to Kohler and go to their ceramic residency and learn slip casting and porcelain. And so that was such an awesome experience. And for those of you who are like artists and making, and you're in a particular medium and you feel like this is it, there's something very helpful and informative and empowering in terms of shifting and exploring another medium. Because even if you decide that you don't want to work in that forever, you learn more about one thing by understanding its like opposite thing, if that makes sense. So anyways, I really took a deep dive into ceramics, and that was in 2014. And I was able to take a sabbatical, yay, that was such a gift. I had 2 kids at that time, and so I was commuting back and forth from the factory to my home to still try and put my kids to bed, and it was too much. I almost lost my mind, I'll be honest with you. But I ended up making like that same piece that was my first canvas in metal. I ended up making that in the round, it's now part of the Art Center's collection, which was really nice. If you do that residency, the deal is that they pay for your travel, your housing, they give you a stipend. I mean, they really take care of you. So if you are looking for residencies, look for ones where you don't have to pay them, they pay you. And the other deal, though, is that they collect one piece from whatever it is that you made in that residency. And that was the only piece that I finished. So I was like, curses. But slip casting is amazing because you make a mold and you can make many, many. So I made many copies of those legs. I made many copies of that like big sphere. It kind of looks like, I've been told it looks like a big golf ball. Anyways, I was able to make more. And so because I had those parts, I was really kind of empowered to then go back to my studio and really explore. So all of these, paintings that I had made, I was then exploring them in the round, and they had a lot of power when you were able to like walk around them and really experience them on a one-to-one physical human scale. So I also learned felting. So that's felted wool. And so a lot of my work does have all these domestic references, and a lot of it is also because of like the life that I'm living. So I felt it over Easter eggs. And so there is like a plastic core in them that I've told will off gas and whatever. but built over one of those big balls again. And because I'm a metalsmith, like really at my core, all of this can be undone. So like whatever I've put together, there's no glue. Everything is drilled in, cold connected. Everything that's been done can be undone. And so that's really great for transport, for repair, all sorts of reasons. Integrity, structural integrity. So like this whole ball comes off. I learned after the first one. And then all of these two legs all actually screw into the pedestal base. So all of these parts can be taken into smaller units and then shipped off wherever with instructions, so I don't have to set it up every time. So I made a bunch of these large-scale figurative pieces. I won't show everything. But then because I also made maquettes while I was at the residency. I made these little minis just to test out structure first. That actually started this nice and interesting side series. So I had these human scale groupings, and then for reference, I made molds of Barbie doll legs. So that is the scale that we're working with. And in terms of the content, I felt like it was actually interesting and on point. And there was like you had a different take on the work, whether it was 1-to-1 scale or you were like literally towering over it. And I thought that was interesting. So changing mediums, it can be really instructive for an artist. Changing scales can be really instructive. And you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And so I did a ton of these. And because they were on this small scale, I could make them in my basement. I was slip casting these tiny little molds. And I really started to like expand the materials. So I brought back the felt. I started working with polymer clay, which is some of the opaque, smooth textures that you're seeing in there. And again, like everything is kind of put together with tiny little screws and like a metalsmith would do. And so I'm really interested in repetition of form, just on a formal level. I really enjoy that, and the idea of creative play. So as an artist, I have a lot of parts, and I will oftentimes, when I'm working, will have lots of materials and parts out. And I feel like when things get too serious, when you take yourself too seriously, reminders to just creatively play in your studio in order to kind of get re-energized, and that's how a lot of that series was made. I still make them sometimes. And around 2016, the Racine Art Museum, which you hopefully has anyone gone to the Racine Art Museum before? You're so close, a few of you. If you haven't and you're interested especially in crafts, make it a point to take a visit to this museum. They have an amazing craft collection. And so around 2016, I had been in a group show with them previously, and so the curator had invited me to have a solo exhibition, but not in the interior traditional galleries. They have these windows here. So I can't remember how many windows. I'm not going to take a second to count, but it's about 90 feet of department store windows, if you can envision that, that are about 4 feet deep with these glass back walls that cap them. They invited me to have a show there. And so it was a really nice opportunity to expand that series and find a place to really show those large-scale figurative works. So it was challenging because nothing could attach to the glass walls. It's only 4 feet deep. And the show would be up for an entire year, but there had to be some sort of change after a 6-month period. Something in the show had to change. So that's a pretty tall order. And but they paid you to do it, so it was like a nice and really well supported opportunity. I felt like it was worth my while. So I was like, game on, let's do this. I have all these parts. I know that I can find a way to make this work. And so I ended up creating these custom pedestals for each of these pieces. I had all those legs, and I hadn't fully finished all of them, but it was a really great opportunity to do that. I was able to borrow that sculpture that is here from the Arts Center, which was really generous of them. And so what I did was that the spheres that look like golf balls, they're hollow, obviously, and or maybe not so obviously, they're hollow. And I lined them with rubber on the inside, and they had holes that had been drilled into them when they were still green. And so I basically had all these repeated parts that I had mentioned, and so I made them so that a number of these, I could cold connect them, and I would insert parts with steel rods in the end so that it would just kind of reach in and grab. And then at the 6-month time, I could change those out. Does that make sense? There's like pins and everything. So that's sort of the in-process experience of that. And there's that one piece done. So all of those are slip cast porcelain forms that had pins going through, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of see with the reflection some of those other forms that were going down. So I made a number of those. And so each one was kind of saying something a little bit different in terms of this idea that I had originally started with about like taking away power, but then at times they feel quite powerful. And so I'm interested in that like space, that liminal space. I also had thought this would be like an interesting opportunity to have some suspended pieces that were really also thinking about these ideas of gender and how I had these 2 young children, and they were developing into these beings with personalities. And if anyone here also has kids, I was thinking about perception, right? And thinking about gender assigned colors, right? And the arbitrariness of that, and how that is pushed from before they're even out of your body. It's already, these sort of associations and these roles and these expectations are pushed. And so I was thinking about that pink and that blue, and like how suffocating that really is. And I wanted to make something about that. I had all this experience working in industrial spaces in Cleveland, doing larger scale enamel. And I'd made a friendship with this neon studio that was really close to where I worked in Appleton, Wisconsin, called the Glow Tube Studio. And so this particular artist repaired neon signs, antique signs, like very niche work. But if anyone's familiar with neon signage, oftentimes the backing pieces are enameled steel. And so he had created this really large enameling kiln for this just repair necessity in his work. And so I asked him, I was like, hey, can I come enamel some stuff in your giant kilns? And he was like, yes, come. And we had the best time. And so I ended up making these large scales, laser cut steel pieces. So I made my design in Illustrator. And I was also just thinking about like forms and assigned objects. And so it's a series of guns that are sort of collaged radially as silhouettes to kind of make these floral forms. And then kind of just playing around with color and design. And this kind of became these book-ended suspended pieces that were part of this installation. So that was a project. And if anybody who knows me knows that I'm an avid gardener, and I'm really passionate about gardening. I really wanted to cut those trees down so that way I could photograph this installation. I never got a good shot of it because those goddamn trees were right there. But
Grandma likes to garden.
yes, and it's like, it's always a tension point, right? And the art, the earth. So anyways, this was one of the first iteration of that installation. I am not that strong, sir.
Yeah, she's not She-Hulk.
Not. Well, in my mind I am. So anyway, I did that work, and and the exploration continues. And so in 2016, I took a position at Ball State University, which is in Muncie, Indiana. That's where I live currently. And I was really interested in Muncie because I really wanted a program where I could like kind of grow and expand. And this particular program, it's named Ball State because it's the Ball Brothers Corporation started this university, and the Ball Brothers Corporation makes mason jars. So those Ball mason jars, right? One of those companies. And Muncie is situated in an interesting location because, we're just about a couple hours south of Lake Michigan, and so north central Indiana. And we're really close to the dunes, so they could get sand from Lake Michigan and the dunes. There are an amazing amount of natural gas reserves that are underground in that region of Delaware County, right? And they had a lot of opportunities for labor. So anyways, they started this glass corporation and then a university. And so this university had a really good reputation for kind of studio craft with the faculty that were there, really strong ceramics, metals, and glass program. So I was really interested in going there. But then when I got there, you know, and I grew up in Cleveland, so I understood kind of like that history of industrialism, but also the evacuation of such industries and how that has really wreaked havoc on the Midwest in particular. And so coming to Muncie, it's very economically depressed, really. And parts of Cleveland and like all along that, you know, that yellow strip that I have on there is all part of that Rust Belt story that really started in the late 70s, basically when I was born. And so I've been sort of witnessing that like very, you know, slow and now swift economic depression. And then it kind of showed, this one was interesting because it kind of shows like where places have recovered and where they haven't. And so I was like, I did all this reading about the Rust Belt and that history and like thinking about like my place in this, and I'm not gonna solve the economic problems of our country, but I was really interested in the intersection again of like, what can I be involved in this place and what's still here, you know, and like what can I glean, what can I learn? And so I had always wanted to learn metal spinning. Is anybody familiar with that? Yeah, some of you know. Some people, when I've described it, like say you're in a bar and like, I'm a metal spinner, they'd be like, so you spin plates for the carnival? Or like, what? And I'll explain what it is, but it's a metal forming technique that was, you know, like early industrialization. It's a way of like making parts that are circular and radial, just like if you understand about like throwing a pot on a wheel, or if you've seen glass blowing and they're spinning and blowing something up on a pipe. Same concept, you're just using like a metal lathe. So I went to this shop out of the blue, like a few years after I got hired. It wasn't right away. And it's this 4th generation company called Muncie Metal Spinning, and it's like this massive warehouse of like the most amazing tools. And so I just started to develop a relationship with this company. And specifically this guy, this is John Ulrich. He's the great-grandson of the person who started this company. And we first started by like watching a demonstration of the process with my class. And so what he's doing on this form is he's actually making a spiral slide. And so it's basically a giant donut form. Okay, like a helix. And it's like you can kind of see, I'll show a video of it in a second. There's a solid wood shape of this donut form, and then you get a big flat disc of whatever metal you want to be that shape, and there's a pin in the center, and you slide it on, and it can be small, or this is extremely large and unusual what he's doing. And then you use these tools, these rollers, and it just, as it's spinning, it's like pushing it, and it conforms against that wood form. And so with this, they make these production slides. And so basically they imagine like a big donut, but then you cut halfway through, so like the radius, and then you like, and you spiral it up like a piece of fusilli pasta, and then you put a ladder on it. And it's kind of amazing. So we were just like totally blown away by this studio, and it was like this relic that is still going, but kind of like a skeleton crew of what it used to be. And so I was like, I gotta do something here. So I started kind of my own residency again. I started working, I apprenticed with them, basically. They said, if you know my university position doesn't work out, I have a job as a spinner, which is possible in this environment. Anyways, that's like a small one that I learned on, a little baby one. So like see that on the right, those little brass feet are just maybe like 4 inches in diameter. So I started training during the pandemic. So we were all in lockdown, and I had already originally planned to do this work. So this is that process, if that makes sense. You know, that was me learning on a much smaller form. And so you can use aluminum, steel, and then the sky's the limit. You know, they make a lot of, that's John. They have race car parts, hubcaps, manufactured parts, like anything circular. What?
Muffler?
That one, I think they might, possibly. So I've been training, yeah, I guess it's 2026, for about 6 years now. So that first, this was like what I made in my first summer, and I was like, oh my gosh, what can I do with all this stuff? So I started just like making more of those like minis, but I took away the floral element and was just kind of like using legs and combining it with different materials and combining and doing a lot of creative play to say something.
Is that supposed to be a lamp or a thing with legs?
Both. It's a hybrid form. So it was actually trying to be like stacked laundry. So folded towels, but then like a very sort of like ornamental cast brass element on top to kind of fix it together, like a curtain rod end. Just kind of taking domestic symbols and putting them together.
It looks like a lamp with legs.
It's very possible. It's a glass piece on the bottom that I had someone blow for me. Sort of a lot of domestic symbols, an egg form, if you will. So anyways, I made a lot of pieces with these spinning and just kind of continuing the conversation. Everything is put together cold, so that way it could all be undone again. This was this was a piece about the first tornado that we survived in Indiana. Ooh, scary.
Tornadoes are not my thing.
Same. I'm terrified of tornadoes, and I live in Indiana. So anyways, so here's just some of these pieces. Oh, I just realized I'm getting close to time. So I should have stopped a few minutes ago. Very quickly. So I continued a lot of this work, but I started segueing into working with glass beads as a way to create patterns and still making those miniature sculptures, and was really interested in using the individual seed bead and making like really elaborate patterns that would get melted into these spun forms. And so I made these whole series of textiles that were all individual seed beads on these dimensional spun forms. So very quickly, so I went through and I made a lot of these. I took away the figure, I took away the representation, and I just focused on the patterns. And I was really interested in labor. So here's sort of a beginning, middle, and end. And I was really interested in how textiles could really tell a story of their own without needing the figure. And I also did a residency at the Pittsburgh Glass Center and was exploring some of those spun forms. How could they engage with glass, with seed beads? And so just doing lots of different tests. So all of these were glass forms that were blown into those metal objects that I had made. And then combined the seed beads into that conversation as well. My most recent project that I really want to share with you briefly is this project called the Threads Project. So I took all of those seed beads that I had been using and reinterpreting these textiles initially of my own life, my own stories, my own spaces. And I got a series of grants through some different entities from the state of Indiana. And I started making this large, elaborate, community-based project where I was working with first-generation immigrants to my region in Muncie and Delaware County, and wanting to highlight this invisible community, especially in this moment where a lot of these communities are being targeted and trying to be eliminated from these spaces and these communities. And I asked them to loan me a textile from their home country that they brought with them. I reinterpreted that pattern with the seed beads on these spun forms. I represented 24 different people from our community, 24 different countries. And we worked together for 2 years. It was a really long project. And we did a photo shoot of the original textile, mostly with the person in that photo if they were comfortable. Sometimes they weren't. And so we had a sort of a before, right, and a now, kind of thinking about where they came from and the spaces that they're living in. And so here's some of those people, some of those stories. I try to get as a diverse representation as possible. The people that I asked started off as just friends that I happened to know in the community, but really quickly kind of became a recommendation, sort of this constellation or network of people within Muncie. And some of the stories were really incredible. So this piece was a little crocheted pin that was about the Bosnian genocide, and that her family, every man in her family was assassinated. And so this pin was to commemorate, and remember her family. And so like really powerful stories. And so it was a really like awesome experience. It was really gratifying. We just had a show of this exhibition starting first in Muncie. And then now it's next week, I'm setting it up at the Indianapolis airport. And the show will be traveling. But this is kind of like where I've been working most recently. This is where I put all of my energy. What was really crazy was that in the reception, the day that the show was opening, we had to redact some of the names of the participants because they were uncomfortable with being identified. ICE had kind of come into Muncie a few weeks before that, and none of that could have been like planned. It was just absolutely bananas. Anyways, people showed up who felt comfortable showing up. Here's an installation of all of the beaded pieces together. So in the show, I put the beaded work together, and then the photographs were kind of surrounding. I'll show you a very quick picture. Here's some detail shots of it. So they're quite dimensional relief works. So here's a shot from that exhibition. And so yeah, that's the woman that I was telling you about with the crochet pin. That's her with her daughter, both wearing that commemorative pin. And so each participant, had a photograph and then some information about the story of why their textile was meaningful. And so the whole point was to try and textiles will degrade, our memories degrade. And so the idea of really reinterpreting some of these pieces in glass and metal, which will last longer than all of us will, was kind of a way to really honor this group and have something that will last. So here's some of the people that made it to the reception, and it was a really amazing experience. And I think what's next for me is I'm thinking about working larger scale and taking some of these patterns and blowing them up, and so kind of making a segue into some larger public art works. So thank you for your attention, and I'm so sorry, Jill, I went over a little bit. I'm so sorry.